Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by viewers like you.
This week on New Mexico in Focus, promising polling for state Democrats. We break down data on key state races and look ahead to the issues driving the governor's race. Plus,
I think it really illustrates the importance of having somebody from a community represent that community and tell that story.
a debut novelist explains the importance of Indigenous stories being told from an Indigenous perspective. New Mexico in Focus starts now. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm your host, Gene Grant. There's been some progress in Las Vegas, New Mexico, where people are in danger of losing their clean drinking water. Ash and debris from the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire contaminated much of the supply, but the installation of a new temporary treatment system is on track. In the second half of the show, the Line Opinion panel and I will try to figure out how we can avoid a situation like this in the future. There's a new warning of an extreme and prolonged heat wave that could hit the Southwest in the coming days. Scientists say it could create new wildfire conditions, but it will certainly have a larger impact on the ecosystem. In about 30 minutes, our land senior producer, Laura Paskus, talks with a UNM professor about the devastating effects these heat waves have on wildlife. But first, we're combing through new data ahead of the November election. According to polling from the Albuquerque Journal, Democrats have firm leads in several key state contests. But the race for governor is a bit closer. Let's get to the line. Welcome to our Line Opinion panelists for the week. We have former New Mexico State Senator Dee Dee Feldman. CEO of Girl Scouts of New Mexico, Rebecca Latham, is with us. Thank you, Rebecca. And investigative and enterprise reporter at the Las Cruces Sun News, Algernon Damasa, is with us as well. Thank you, Algernon. We're going to start it off in the political arena after new polling in the Albuquerque Journal. That poll shows double-digit leads for Democrats in 4 key state offices: Attorney General, Secretary of State, Treasurer, and Commissioner of Public Lands. We'll get to the governor's race in a moment, where Michelle Lujan Grisham has a 7-point lead. But starting broadly, Senator Feldman, were you at all surprised to see such big leads for Democrats across the board in New Mexico?
I was not surprised for those statewide offices, other than governor, to see at least a 10-point lead. I think that's reflected in registration data. And I think also for some of those offices, the voters revert to their political party and not so much the personalities, with the exception of the Attorney General.
Right.
And crime is on everybody's minds. And I think that explains Raul Torres's good standing, along with the fact that he had a rigorous primary in which he advertised statewide and became well known for that reason. But no, that did not surprise me. These folks, Secretary of State and the Land Commissioner in particular, are incumbents, and they've been in the news. They are known to people in New Mexico, whereas their opponents are not.
Rebecca, interestingly, that treasurer's race kind of catches my eye there. Oh, actually, let me start with this. Let me back up. The race for AG that was just mentioned, GOP candidate Jeremy Gay doesn't have the same name recognition as Raul Torres, certainly as Senator just mentioned, but for those who are familiar with him, many are pretty enthusiastic about him. Do you think this race will get any tighter by any chance?
I mean, I think there's always a possibility. There's still, between now and November, there's still a lot of time left where we can see some shifts. What I think was interesting to me was how many Republicans said that they would vote for the Democratic candidate versus how few Democratic voters said that they would vote for the Republican candidate and state treasurer. Senator Feldman, I echo everything that she says about, it's so hard in these statewide races when no one knows who you are and you're not pulling the campaign support to really establish your name.
Algernon, interestingly, governor. Let's get to the governor. Her lead is a bit wider than the last way, to early polling. Do you expect that gap? Personal opinion I'm asking here, certainly, but in your professional opinion, is that gap poised to get even wider, or can Mr. Ronchetti make a push late here? And if he can, what could he ride in on, so to speak?
I would expect it to tighten, although you're right that the most recent polling suggests that the governor is widening what was a pretty slim lead for a while. The governor has emerged from the pandemic and consequent challenges, as well as some other issues politically that beat down her approval ratings considerably. But now there's a choice to make, and we're learning much more about the positions that Mark Ronchetti offers in the alternative. And interestingly, one thing that has been, a lot of eyes have been on how the overturning of Roe v. Wade this summer would affect the contest. And I think one indication of whether that's going to have an effect in New Mexico, which acted preemptively to protect abortion rights in the state in anticipation of this very event. One thing to look at is new registration of voters and how many women were registering to vote. In states like Kansas, there was a pretty sizable increase in the number of women as a percentage of new voter registrations. In New Mexico, it has stayed largely the same. However, I think perhaps, especially with the announcement on August 31st about the governor's plans to fund a new full spectrum reproductive health clinic in southern New Mexico in Doña Ana County. I think perhaps that's going to become an issue debated, and we'll see if it moves the numbers for either candidate in either direction.
Senator, I'm glad Algernon brought that up. I'm very, very glad. Interesting. It says to me the governor is feeling pretty safe in her position of where we're going here. And maybe perhaps to add to that, in the polling we're referencing here, 50% of women support Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham to 32% for Mark Ronchetti. That's a pretty big gap. Does Mr. Ronchetti, is there anything Mark Ronchetti can do at this point to get out from under this abortion issue and increase his numbers with women here?
Well, it's no surprise, and it's not a coincidence that the governor used her power to announce a abortion clinic to be located in southern New Mexico, where the polling data shows that support for abortion is even stronger than in Albuquerque, which was a surprise to me in that recent polling by Sanderoff. But I think the problem that Ronchetti is having is that he made a statement to Steve Smotherton, the controversial pastor of Legacy Church, that yes, he was opposed to all abortion, but for politics' sake, to be realistic, he was going to take a more moderate approach of opposing abortion, but accepting when there was a threat to the life of the mother, or in cases of rape and incest. So that brings that puts him kind of on the hot seat there because of that inconsistency. And I think, the polling data shows how strong Michelle Lujan Grisham is amongst women and amongst Hispanics.
Yes.
And that's the base that Ronchetti has to crack into in order to move his numbers. And by the way, there is another poll out too that shows that the governor's lead is not as substantial as the one in the Albuquerque Journal. That's the Greenberg-Quinlan poll, which puts Lujan Grisham at 48% and Ronchetti at 44%. So that's a 4% difference. And that's surmountable.
That's right. That's a good point there. I appreciate your last point there. Rebecca, I got to get you in on this one. The Journal poll, of course, covered abortion as well, which I thought was actually kind of brilliant. Only 12% of New Mexicans support outlawing abortion across the board. So I ask again that, Mr. Ronchetti has really got himself in a corner painted by, somebody else, but he's in it nonetheless. Can he actually back away from this and really get some credible traction at this point?
So I think he has no choice, and I do want to point out that he and his campaign have denied making that, even having that conversation with that pastor Steve Smotherman. Okay. So and I think Mark has been very transparent for those who are listening about, like, yes, he does have a personal opinion about abortion rights, but he also recognizes that that's not necessarily what New Mexicans want. In that journal poll where only 12% said that abortion should be illegal all the time, it said 35% said that it should be legal all the time. The sweet spot there is that combined, so 22% say it should be legal with limitations and 25% say it should be illegal with limitations, which means 47% of the people polled have some sort of common ground on the earth. It's either it's legal with limits or it's illegal with limits, but it's like that there's some sort of a compromise. And so I think Ronchetti is going to have to tap into that, perhaps. The other thing I think is really interesting in this poll overall is while, 47% say they want to vote for Governor Lujan Grisham and 40% say Ronchetti, the fact that 13% of voters have no confidence in either, 5% of them are they're so unhappy with the choices that they're willing to vote for someone who literally cannot win. And then 13% saying that they're unhappy with either choice. So they're just going to wait until the last minute to figure out who they're voting against. They're not voting for either candidate. They're going to vote against. And so it's going to be up to these two frontrunners to really establish the difference between themselves and the lesser of the two evils.
That's a good point there. Rebecca, let me stay with you with this one thing here. If he got he being Mr. Ronchetti, if an endorsement came in from President Trump, would that be impactful for him? Would that put a little wind in his sails at this point?
At this point, I mean, frankly, no.
Right.
I don't think so. But I also don't think that he is seeking any sort of endorsement. We saw in the primary that the Trump Republican lost horribly. We see this more and more, I think, in some of the statewide races we were talking about. You have Trump Republicans that are running for office, and it's really hurting them. So where you see it working in everywhere else in the country, just like we know in New Mexico, doesn't mean it's going to work here. And so I don't think that would really be something that the Ronchetti campaign would be seeking.
I appreciate your points there. Thank you to the other two for letting me kind of stretch out there with Rebecca a little bit. They're very interesting points. Thank you for that analysis. We're already zeroing in on November, so stay with us for continued election coverage on candidates and the issues in the coming months. We'll be right back here with the Line panel in about 10 minutes to discuss a new tool to slow overdose deaths.
As the temperatures increase, we get a reversal in the gradient for heat loss, right? When the environmental temperature gets hotter than our bodies, with mammals or birds, then we get heat gain from the environment. And we also have our internal heat we have to get rid of, right? To maintain a stable body temperature.
A new novel released this month gives a unique perspective on the Southwest and Native culture. Shudder is a crime thriller with a touch of supernatural horror and a coming-of-age story. The book follows a young woman from the Navajo Nation who becomes a forensic photographer working for the Albuquerque Police Department, but she's hiding a secret. She can see ghosts. This week, correspondent Antonia Gonzalez speaks with Danae writer and filmmaker Ramona Emerson about her debut book.
Ramona, welcome to New Mexico in Focus.
Thank you, Antonia. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're already well known for your filmmaking. Now here we have an acclaimed debut novel, Shudder, different form of storytelling for you. How did this book come about?
Well, I couldn't, 5 years ago I would have told you I don't even know if I could make it happen. I've never thought of myself as a fiction writer. Even the beginning of that particular book started out as a documentary idea. I thought maybe I would like to do a documentary about Navajos who deal with death in their jobs, people like police officers, doctors, pathologists, scientists, and talk about what is ingrained, how is death so foreboding for Navajo people, and why do we have our beliefs? And so I started doing research on that, but in the process of doing that I realized that I don't know if it would make a great documentary. Not a lot of people wanted to talk to me about that, so it kind of put a squash on that. But at the same time, I started to think about my own life working as a forensic videographer here in Albuquerque and how that would make an interesting story. So I kind of did an introspective and started to think, well, maybe other people don't want to talk about it, but I can talk about it. I dealt with it for 16 years. And then it started. It was a very long 10 years of writing in between film projects and in between parenting and all the craziness of life. So it took me 10 years to finish it, but I'm really happy with where it ended up.
So how much of your life, I mean, you're from the Navajo Nation. I really connected with the grandmother in the story. I mean, I was really close with my Navajo grandmother. So how much of it are people going to find that you put in with your own life experiences?
Well, I think almost all of the stuff with the grandma and the character comes from things that my grandma and myself did. I mean, I grew up with my grandma a good portion of my childhood, and you know, those are real things that we experienced and things that she would talk to me about. And you know, I think pretty much all of that is part of me. I may have embellished here and there, but those are my memories. And growing up in Tohatchi, I really wanted to make Tohatchi a character of the book because that's my hometown, and you know, and it's really important for me to showcase it and you know, talk about it the way I always remember it. And some of it's taken from my own experiences working with as a forensic videographer, and just thinking about how my work impacted like my emotions and how I would think about people who I filmed for legal reasons for years, for months. I mean, their stories and their lives would impact me deeply, and I kind of used those emotions and gave them to Rita in a different way. Of course, I didn't see ghosts, and I didn't communicate with ghosts while I was working forensics. That would have probably made it a little easier, but I was able to use my emotions that I had working those cases and give them to Rita as kind of a supernatural power instead, because they evoke the same emotions in her, and she would think about their families and who they left behind, and that's what motivates you to do that kind of work.
And to add to that, it is, you know, a crime and supernatural aspects of this book, and we know there are a lot of taboos out there in tribes across the country, just not Navajo Nation, but a lot of tribes. So how did you approach that? Are you worried, or were you worried about any backlash or any criticism?
I am worried. And I have to say, when I was in the process of writing it, I would often say, oh, geez, are you going to write that? Are you going to put that in? What would your grandma say? You know, I mean, I had those internal dialogues with myself. How are Navajos going to take this story? And I realized that I did a lot of research about death and about how Navajos came to this pinnacle of being so afraid of death that you don't even talk about it. It's not something that's even supposed to be a part of your life. And I began to realize that looking at other cultures and looking at other rituals around the world, and doing deep research about all these how different people believe and how different people think about it, I kind of felt that the Dene are real anchored to the Spanish flu, and I think the Spanish flu epidemic really had a huge impact on how Navajos feel about death and their fear of it. Because before that, the research really doesn't show that. It's like they're moving on to the next world. It's a rebirth. And then at some point, it turns into this evil monster. And for me, I felt like this is a good time to have these discussions. Instead of hiding from them, we need to face them. And I think that a lot of people, like the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission, are even starting to talk about traditional funeral practices and about how we deal with death. And so I think even in mainstream academia, we're starting to really think about that and wonder if there's a different way to approach things. And so I thought that it would be a good opening for dialogue. But at the same time, I also thought, well, you know, for decades, Dene have been reading Tony Hillerman, and he talks all kinds of spooky stuff that I would never put in a book, never. And they read those books. So reading something like this that I know I didn't put any sensitive knowledge in because I know better, that they should be fine reading this book. And if we want to have a discussion about death and we want to talk about those taboos, now's the time to do it.
We know there are not a lot of non-native writers out there who are writing about the Navajo Nation, who are writing about other tribes across the country. So what does it mean for you as an Indigenous person, as a woman, to be sharing and telling a story through this book, something that we understand and we know, what the do's and don'ts of?
Well, I think it really illustrates the importance of having somebody from a community represent that community and tell that story. Because not only do you get falsehoods and stories written about people or written about us from people outside of our communities, I think there's a lot of falsehoods. I think there's a lot of chance for, romanticizing our way of life. There's a lot of chance to stereotype us. And that continues to happen. And it always boggles the mind to me. I never tell stories outside of my community because, even if I was going to tell a story about a Pueblo community, I make sure that they have exhausted every resource to find somebody from their own community to do that. And if they don't find somebody, at least we can include some young people as part of the project. So they're in development. There will be somebody who can take over these stories after, I'm gone. But that's really important to me. Even through my film work, it's always been a real thorn to me to find people who continue to make these stories and continue to get funded to tell our stories when our own Indigenous filmmakers are struggling to make ends meet, are struggling to have their projects financed. So for me, it's a big stick. So writing a book like this, I think, really shows that deep understanding of cultural taboo, the deep understanding of what stories you tell, what stories you have the right to tell, what stories that you should be telling. There are some stories that you should not be telling, and a lot of those people who don't come from our communities are telling that stories when they shouldn't. And, I can't stop that from happening. People are going to do what they do. But the trick is to have these discussions so that people understand why it's wrong. People understand why you don't tell that story. Out of respect, out of traditional belief, you don't tell that story, or you only tell that story during a certain part of the year. People don't understand that because they don't come from our communities. So it's really important to educate these people.
Welcome back to our panelists. The State Department of Health is giving out a life-saving tool to drug users: fentanyl test strips. A recent piece from the Albuquerque Journal details the tactic, which Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham approved in February. New Mexico has one of the highest overdose rates in the country. And Algernon, do you expect these testing strips will have a significant impact lowering, I realize the word significant is problematic here, but would it have an impact lowering overdose rates if used properly, from what you've seen so far?
It seems so. It's important to humanize the people who are struggling with substance abuse addiction, and these are people who have decision-making faculties and are concerned for their health and welfare. And so the fentanyl strips really do it's interesting. One of the anecdotes about fentanyl strips was that people at first thought they were defective because they were turning up positive results almost all the time when people tested their heroin supply. And they later confirmed, no, it's because so much of the heroin supply is tainted with fentanyl.
Right.
And I think that's eye-opening. It's not a panacea, and it doesn't liberate people from the shackles of substance abuse and addiction, opioid addiction, and all the rest of it. But I think it is useful information that will certainly have an impact. It's also interesting. It wasn't long ago that fentanyl strips were classified as drug paraphernalia.
Oh, wow.
And I think that shift kind of speaks to the larger shift of viewing this not as a moral problem, but as a public health problem. And really even just spiritually an assault on human freedom.
Yep.
And so I think that, little by little, as we reframe these tools as being not things that give permission for an immoral activity, but actually tools that can help if we are using our interventions strategically and with tremendous resolve and direction, can actually help to liberate people from the dependency in the prison of substance abuse addiction.
Yep. Well said. Just a reminder to the viewers, we're talking 70% of U.S. drug overdoses are from fentanyl. 70%. Now, Senator, let me ask you this. Test strips along with Narcan, of course, that's out in the news. A lot of folks know what it is, both effective and saving lives. That's why the governor signed the bill making test strips legal. But now that these tools are there, how can we start to reach people before they're on the brink of overdose? Isn't that the next step?
Well, that's always been the real key, and that's the hard part, prevention. Yeah. You know, it boils down to prevention, and what does that mean? I mean, it means school-based health clinics. It means activities that kids can say yes to, like the Girl Scouts and other activities. It means peer counseling. It means a robust behavioral health system, which we don't have. Mm-hmm. And so any of these tools that are pioneered, and we have a great record with the Department of Health. They do have the resolve. Right. They do have the history dating back to needle exchange in 1997, mm-hmm. introduced here. To try to meet people where they're at, not where they should be, but where they're at. And the prevention part is the hardest part, because mm-hmm. that's the one that always does not get the funds in comparison to the crisis part.
Yep, good point there. Rebecca, just a point that Senator made about the Department of Health, their report, New Mexico Department of Health, they're reporting over at least 1,200 people, and probably a lot more than that, have died from fentanyl overdoses in the state since 2019. But at the same time, officials say more than 12,000 people have been saved from a drug overdose by Narcan. That's hard to ignore, that number, 12,000. Should there be an argument anymore about these fentanyl strips and other things that we're doing to abate this? I mean, is the point proven?
I think the point is very well proven. And I think, I don't understand what argument is there against making these resources available outside of, should we be using, government funding for this or not? Mm-hmm. And thankfully, where we are in New Mexico right now is we're not having to look for pennies in between the couch cushions for anything. So like the resources are available. Let's get them out there, mm-hmm. And keep saving lives. To elaborate on what the senator said about prevention and getting in our schools and starting to talk about that, mm-hmm. like my children are in elementary and middle school, and we have a lot of other moms whose kids are in middle and high school who are having to have conversations with their kids about things that were seemingly harmless, like cannabis being used by kids in middle and high school that are now cannabis is being laced with fentanyl. Wow. And kids thinking like, oh, well, it's just weed. It's not anymore. Right. And so we have to, if this is happening in middle school, then that means in elementary school, we have to be making resources available and finding the best way to educate our children about the dangers of this, going down this rabbit hole. It's mm-hmm. not easy to get back out. Right. And so I think anything that we can put into educating our students is going to be major in the long-term solution. Mm-hmm.
Algernon, I ask you to pick up on what Rebecca just took us to. I appreciate this because we've seen reports across the country in the last week of new pills made to look like candy that contain fentanyl. And DEA Administrator Ann Milgram is calling for groups behind these drugs to drive it. They're trying to drive addiction in young people. Do we need to do a better job about educating children about these dangers, particularly in school, as Rebecca was just mentioning?
Oh, yes. And really, when I was a kid during the Reagan era war on drugs, when it was really framed, the drug education for us kids was really framed around a moral binary choice. And I am now raising my own children in a community where I have reports of children of school age being actively pursued by traffickers who are trying to instill addiction in people, basically to guarantee themselves a market. Sort of like an even darker parallel to how cigarettes were marketed and became such an institution in American life. This is now happening on the streets of the community where I live. And so the education really needs to be different, and it really needs to be framed as hazard, harm, that the people trying to offer you an experience with these things are not offering you friendship, they're offering you bondage to a substance and perhaps an attack on your health and life.
That's right. Yep. Senator, let's finish here. Policymakers, where are they here in New Mexico? Meaning, perhaps a task force, perhaps a something to kind of get this more to the surface here in New Mexico. Because as I read it here again from the Department of Health, they've given out 15,000 test strips since the changes took effect in mid-May, and they've already ordered another 50,000. This is going to be a part of our life here. So is there an educational campaign that has to come from our legislature partly here?
Well, the legislature has done a job. It passed the bill.
True.
The executive is now getting her department to form regulations. But yes, I think we need a big education campaign, and the Department of Health has learned a lot about that because they have run anti-tobacco programs specifically geared toward youth.
Yep.
And they've done that. They use the tobacco funds that came to the state as a result of the tobacco settlement back in the late 90s, and ran all kinds of prevention programs using peer counseling, using school-based clinics, using very culturally appropriate stuff. That could be a model for a lot of the stuff geared toward young people.
Good points there, and I appreciate you bringing up the needle exchange. That was pretty forward thinking back when that we did here. That was really ahead of the curve, so we can get ahead of that curve again, certainly. Yeah. We'll have to wrap that up there, but thank you all for your thoughts. We'll be back here at the virtual roundtable one final time in less than 15 minutes to talk about the devastating impacts now extinguished wildfires are still having. But first, another environmental concern that has the potential to lead to more fire late in 2022. Scientists are warning of an extreme and prolonged heat wave starting this week that could fuel dangerous fire conditions into September. Our senior producer Laura Paskus checked in with the University of New Mexico biology professor Blair Wolf to talk about this research on how heat waves affect birds and other wildlife.
Thanks, Professor Wolf, for joining me today to talk about the impact of heat waves on birds.
My pleasure.
So worldwide, heat waves are increasing in frequency and severity, and at the end of July, President Biden actually issued an executive order regarding extreme heat. The risks to humans are serious and deadly worldwide. But I'd like to start with you with a technical question, thermoregulation. How do birds regulate their body temperature versus how mammals, humans, do?
Sure, and so the general problem is similar for mammals and birds. I mean, we humans, when the environmental temperature is cooler than our body, below 98.6, then we offload heat, what we call passively, through radiation, conduction, and convection. Heat just flows from hot to cold and leaves our body. And thus the internal heat that we produce is dissipated in part to the environment, right? But as the temperatures increase, we get a reversal in the gradient for heat loss, right? When the environmental temperature gets hotter than our bodies, with mammals or birds, then we get heat gain from the environment. And we also have our internal heat we have to get rid of, right? To maintain a stable body temperature. So this is the goal, a process called homeostasis, where we maintain a stable internal environment. When the environmental temperature is hotter than our bodies, the only way we can do that is by evaporating water.